He bought a broken cabin for 50 cents, but within its shadows waited a secret that would test the weight of his very soul.
The evening sun hung low over the desert, bleeding its last fire across the land. Its light caught on the mesas like a slow-burning wick, staining the horizon in bruised purples and fading gold. Heat still clung to the ground, though the air was shifting, cooled by the whisper of a storm swelling far off. Elias Boone pulled the brim of his hat lower and rode his mule along the narrow track that led into Ash Hollow, a scatter of weather-beaten shacks crouched against the wind. He had no plan for staying. He rarely did. The towns he drifted through had a way of closing around him like fists, pressing his breath out until he left again. He had long ago decided a man with too much past ought not to have much future, and so he moved on, never letting his boots gather dust too long in one place. But that night, as he passed the square where townsfolk idled with tired eyes and calloused hands, he heard the crier's voice. "Cabin up yonder, North Ridge. 50 cents will take it. 50 cents. 1 coin buys the whole of it." The words fell into Elias like a pebble into still water, sending ripples through thoughts he had buried deep. He stopped his mule and turned. A knot of townsmen gathered around a wiry auctioneer, his voice sharp against the wind. No one raised a hand. No one offered coin. The cabin, it seemed, carried no worth but trouble. Elias swung down from the saddle. His boots struck dust, and the weight of the coin in his pocket suddenly felt heavier than it ever had in years of carrying it. He had kept it not for bread or whiskey, but as a relic of choice. $50 he had never spent, a reminder that not everything needed using. Yet tonight, he pressed it into the auctioneer's palm. The man looked startled. "Yours, then. Cabin and all its bones." A murmur ran through the crowd, quick as prairie wind. Some faces turned aside, others smirked with the relief of not being the fool. Elias only nodded once, slid the deed into his coat, and led his mule toward the North Ridge. The storm cloud swelled darker behind him, black-purple like an old bruise. The land smelled of dust and creosote, of rain not yet fallen. When he reached the cabin, twilight had softened the edges of the desert, painting the ground with shadows long and thin. The structure leaned against itself, timber warped by years of weather, roof patched with tin that rattled in the wind. The porch sagged, boards split open like tired mouths. But to Elias, who had slept under worse, rail cars, barn lofts, the naked sky, it offered a strange kind of invitation. He pushed the door. It groaned like something waking from a long sleep. Inside lay the scent of dust, hay, and old smoke. The hearth was cold. A rocking chair rested in the corner, unmoving, though the draft stirred cobwebs like ghostly lace. Elias set down his pack and struck a match. The flame revealed a room bare, save for the scatter of hay across the floor and the silence of long abandonment. He knelt, brushed his hand across the boards, and listened to the hollow sound beneath. Curious, he cleared the hay away. His fingers struck iron. A trapdoor. He paused. The flame guttered, bending toward the hidden seam in the floor. Something in him, the part that had lived through war and wandering, through loss and whiskey, tensed like a hunter's snare. Still, he pried the ring and lifted the hatch. The smell that rose was damp earth, rust, and something human. He held the match lower, its glow touching the shadows below. There, half buried in straw, lay a figure. At first he thought her dead, skin pale, dress ragged. But then her chest rose, shallow as a wounded bird's. Her wrists glinted with iron shackles, chains fastened cruelly to the beam. Her hair, once braided, had fallen loose, strands tangled with dust and straw. The dress she wore was a wedding gown, torn at the hem, muddied with soil. Elias drew a sharp breath, the sound loud in the hush of the cabin. He crouched, eyes fixed on her, and for a moment the storm outside seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. The woman stirred. Slowly, her head turned, and her eyes opened. They were storm gray, wide with fear yet fierce with something unbroken. They fixed on him, not pleading, not yielding, but searching. Elias Boone had seen eyes like that before. On fields where men lay dying, on women carrying grief heavier than coffins, on mirrors he avoided for years. Eyes that bore the mark of chains, whether seen or unseen. He whispered, "God help us both." The words vanished in the rafters. For a long time, neither moved. Elias felt the coin-shaped weight of fate settle in his chest. That cabin had cost him nearly nothing, but it had given him something he did not bargain for. A life tethered to his own, thrust upon him like a burden and a gift. Outside, thunder rolled. The storm pressed against the roof, rattling the tin like bones in a drum. Elias set the match aside, drew his knife, and stepped closer to the trapdoor. He knew, then, the cabin was no mere shelter. It was a test, and the choice before him would carve his days as sharp as any blade. And so the drifter, who had wandered from every place he touched, stayed. The storm came in the night, dragging with it the voice of coyotes. Their howls loped across the valley, rising and falling like the cries of old ghosts. The cabin held against the wind, though its timbers moaned as if burdened by secrets too, long carried. Elias Boone sat by the hearth, lamplight painting his face in muted amber. The woman lay upon the straw where he had found her, her shackles cold and cruel around her wrists. He had pried at the iron, but the locks refused him. They were forged heavy, the kind meant not to guard, but to punish. For now, he wrapped her, wounds with linen torn from his own shirt, his rough hands careful despite the calluses. She did not flinch, yet her eyes, storm-gray and watchful, never left his. She had not spoken, not at first. Only breath and silence. Silence so thick it seemed the fire itself burned softer in respect. Elias did not press her. He had lived long enough to know silence could be armor, a wall stronger than stone. When the lamp guttered low, he caught the faintest whisper, a name, cracked and fragile, as if drawn from the deepest well of her being. Clara. He repeated it under his breath, not to claim it, but to hold it steady in the room. A name was a tether. Proof she was still anchored to the living world. The hours stretched thin. Elias brewed coffee, its bitter scent mingling with smoke and the faint tang of iron. He poured a cup, but she would not take it. Only when he left it beside her did her hand, trembling yet steady, reach for it. She sipped once, her lips cracked, her throat working slowly as though each swallow was a struggle between body and spirit. Outside, the storm passed, leaving the desert washed clean under a pale moon. The coyotes' cries drifted farther, softer. The cabin, though battered, seemed to draw itself tighter around the two souls within. Elias watched her from his chair. He saw how her shoulders curled inward, how the chains dragged her posture toward the floor, as if they had weight far beyond metal. He knew that weight. He had carried his own in different form, memory, regret, a sister lost to violence when he was too young and too powerless to stop it. Her absence followed him in every silence, in every firelit night. That was why Clara's silence struck him so hard. It was not emptiness but a presence all its own. A guarded fortress. A refusal to yield what had not been freely given. He said little. Only asked now and then if she hungered, if she wished for water, if she needed warmth. Her replies were glances, the smallest nods, or nothing at all. Yet even in her mistrust, Elias sensed a thread of recognition, the faint, reluctant acknowledgement that he meant her no harm. The fire cracked, embers sparking like stars. The rocking chair in the corner creaked softly when Elias tested it, then settled. Clara's gaze shifted toward it, almost longingly. Perhaps it had once been hers. Or perhaps the sight of it called to some memory gentler than the chains she wore. Elias stood and dragged the chair closer to the fire. With care he lifted her beneath the arms. She stiffened, eyes wide, but did not strike nor cry out. He carried her lightly, for she weighed little more than the memory of a girl, and placed her in the chair. It rocked gently beneath her, the sound quiet as a lullaby. She sat stiff at first, hands folded like shackled prayer. Then, slowly, her shoulders eased. The firelight brushed across her face, turning her hollow cheeks to gold, her eyes to mirrors of smoke and flame. Elias sat back, his rifle propped by the door, a sentinel half comfort and half threat. The old gallows voice of the rafters groaned, above them, reminding him that roofs, like men, could break without warning. Still, For the first time in years, he felt something steady, an anchor against the drifting. The night waned. When she finally slept, head bowed over her bruised wrists, Elias did not close his own eyes. He listened to the wind at the shutters, to the faint rise and fall of her breath, to the way the fire whispered, as if it too guarded her. He thought of the coin he had spent, the 50 cents that had bought him this cabin, this storm, this silence, this girl bound in chains. It felt less like a bargain and more like a summons. The dawn broke pale, casting frost across the ground outside. Elias poured water into the basin, its surface rippling with the tremor of his hands. He studied his own reflection there, a scar. Along his jaw, the lines carved deep from years of sun and grief. A man who had failed once before to keep someone safe. Clara stirred when the light touched her face. She opened her eyes slowly, as though waking was a labor. Her gaze met his, and for a moment there was no fear. Only exhaustion, raw and human. He offered her bread softened in broth. She hesitated, then took it. Small victories mattered. They spoke no more that day, yet their silence grew different. Not the silence of strangers, but the silence of two souls who shared a roof, a fire, a secret. Elias knew her story was carved deeper than the chains on her wrists, and he knew it would come only when she was ready. For now, he gave what he could: warmth, patience, the simple dignity of not prying. When the sun set once more and the coyotes called again, she did not lie on the floor. She sat in the rocking chair, shawl wrapped over her shoulders, the fire painting her in fractured gold, and Elias Boone, who had long believed himself a man beyond redemption, found the faintest glimmer of purpose stirring in him again, like dawn breaking across frozen plains. The days began to stretch, measured not by miles of wandering, but by the quiet rhythm of survival. For Elias Boone, it was a strange adjustment. He was a man accustomed to the open trail, to nights when sleep came beneath shifting stars and mornings that held nothing but the horizon. Yet in Ash Hollow, life narrowed to the shape of a single cabin. At dawn, he brewed coffee over the fire, the dark steam curling like incense through the rafters. Its bitter scent filled the small space, and for the first time in years, he poured, not just one cup, but two. Clara rarely drank more than a sip, but she would cradle the tin mug in her hands, as if for warmth rather than taste. In that small gesture, Elias felt the stir of something unspoken, a truce between silence and trust. By day, he split wood. The crack of the axe against the stump rang through the hollow like a bell tolling the hours. Clara sometimes stood at the window, watching as if the motion of blade and timber marked safety itself. Other times, she traced her fingers along the glass when rain streaked down its surface, her expression distant, as though searching for a world beyond the pain that she once belonged to. Elias said little. Words seemed fragile things, too easily broken by the weight of what had passed. Instead, he offered her the steadiness of routine. The fire tended, the tools mended, the roof patched against the storm. He let the silence between them breathe. It was Clara who broke it first. One evening, as rain drummed on the tin roof like a restless hand, she spoke in halting fragments. Her voice was rough, as if unused to shaping confession. "They came from the town, said I was promised. My father's debt. A wedding, not of my choosing." She paused, gaze fixed on the fire. The flames reflected in her storm-gray eyes, as if the memory itself were burning. "I would not bow. They locked me there, said the earth would teach obedience." Her words fell like stones, heavy with the weight of betrayal. Elias did not press her for names, nor for the shape of cruelties left unspoken. He only listened, his roughened hands folded in stillness, as though the act of listening itself might grant her some measure of release. When silence returned, it was not as sharp as before. It held a softness, the kind found after confession, where pain does not vanish but loosens its grip. Later, while clearing the hay from the corner, Elias's hand brushed against something knotted and dry. He lifted it into the lamplight, a braid once thick and dark, now dulled with dust. Its ribbon was frayed, but it had clearly been cut and hidden. He turned it in his hands, feeling the ache of symbolism in its weight. Childhood severed, girlhood stolen, a relic not of vanity but of control. When Clara saw it, she froze. For a moment her chest tightened as if the air itself had betrayed her. Then she reached out, fingers trembling, and took it from him. She held it against her chest, eyes closing, as though reclaiming what had been taken. Elias did not speak. He understood the braid was more than hair. It was memory, freedom, selfhood bound and cut away. That night, she did not sit in silence. Instead, she moved slowly about the cabin, touching the objects within as if reacquainting herself with the world. Her fingertips lingered on the handle of an old saw, on the face of a broken clock that no longer ticked, on the rough grain of the rocking chair's armrest. Each touch seemed an act of quiet reclamation, of choosing to belong to a space not of captivity, but of survival. Elias watched her, haunted by what had been done to her, yet strangely healed by her persistence. She was not whole, but she was not broken either. Her presence filled the cabin with a strange energy, a reminder that even in silence, life could return. At dusk, the storm swelled again. Wind rattled the tin roof, and rain lashed against the shutters. Inside, the fire burned steady, casting long shadows that swayed with the rocking chair's rhythm. Clara sat wrapped in a shawl Elias had found in a chest, her hair loose, her expression unreadable. Elias felt the urge to speak, to tell her of the sister he had lost, of the guilt that had driven him across deserts and mountains, with no anchor to call home. Yet he held his tongue. The time for such things would come when silence no longer carried the weight of protection. Instead, he poured her another cup of coffee, set it by her hand, and returned to his seat. She looked at him then. Really looked. Not as a captor, nor as a stranger, but as a man who shared her fire. The storm raged outside, its voice a mirror of the storm within them both. Yet within the cabin there was warmth, fragile, flickering, but real. And for the first time since fate had led Elias Boone to the forsaken cabin on the ridge, he felt that perhaps his wandering days had brought him here not by chance, but by necessity. That sometimes what a man found beneath the hay was not a burden, but the beginning of his own salvation. The first sign of danger came with hoofbeats. Elias Boone heard them long before the riders crested the ridge. 3 sets, steady and unhurried, the cadence of men who carried confidence like a weapon. He set down his axe and wiped the sweat from his brow, staring into the low sun that painted the valley in molten hues. The sound grew louder, joined by the faint jingle of spurs and the muffled clatter of rifles against saddles. When the men came into view, Clara was at the window, her body stiffened, and the color drained from her face as if the very sight of them had stolen the warmth from her blood. Elias did not need her words to understand. He saw it in her eyes, storm gray and wide. These were the men who had left her shackled in the dark. They rode with the loose ease of vultures, shoulders slouched yet alert, their laughter cutting across the dry air. One spat into the dust, another raised a hand in mock greeting, his grin sharp as broken glass. "Fine night to be neighborly," the tallest called as they dismounted. Elias stepped onto the porch, his rifle propped against the doorframe within reach. He leaned his weight into the post, posture easy though every sinew of his body was taut. "Cabin's mine now," he said, voice even. "Cost me 50 cents fair and square." The men chuckled, a sound without humor. They pushed inside without waiting, boots dragging dust across the floorboards. The firelight caught their faces, hard, weather-cracked, cruel. They carried whiskey with them, sloshing in bottles that smelled of rot and smoke. Clara froze in the rocking chair, hands folded tight in her lap. She stared at the floor, as if making herself small enough might save her from their gaze. But they saw her. Oh yes, they saw her with the greedy familiarity of men who had once chained her. Still, breathing, one drawled, thought the earth would have taught her by now. The words coiled through the room like a snake. Elias's jaw tightened. He placed himself subtly between them and Clara, the rifle now in his hand though pointed low. "Best leave the dead to the earth," he said quietly, "and the living to their own fate." They laughed again, but the sound wavered at the edge of unease. The fire threw long shadows across the walls, stretching their figures into specters. For a while, the cabin filled with their boasting. Tales of debts collected, women broken, men cowed. They drank deeply, the smell of liquor souring the air. Elias answered their jibes with the patience of a man balancing on the blade of a knife. He gave them no fuel, no spark. Yet his eyes never left them, and his finger brushed the trigger guard like a promise. At last, the tallest man rose. He leaned across the table, his breath hot with whiskey. "We'll be back," he said, voice low, meant for Elias alone. "A cabin like this don't belong to drifters, and she don't belong to anyone but us." The words sank into the silence, like nails driven into wood. Then they were gone, the door banging shut behind them, their laughter fading into the dusk as hoofbeats carried them down the ridge. For a long moment, the cabin did not breathe. Only when the wind shifted did Clara move, pressing both hands against her mouth to smother a sob. Her shoulders shook, the sound of her grief muffled but sharp. Elias set the rifle down and knelt beside her, but he did not touch her. He only said, "They will not take you again." She looked at him then, eyes wet but fierce. For the first time, her silence held not fear but faith. A fragile, desperate trust that he would stand between her and the men who sought to claim her spirit. That night, Elias did not sleep. He sat by the window, rifle across his knees, the moon casting silver across the valley. He thought of his sister, of the day he had failed to stop the men who carried her away. He had been young, unarmed, powerless. She had never returned. That scar had carved him into the drifter he became, a man too hollow for roots. But now, roots had found him, in the form of a cabin bought for $50, in the storm-gray eyes of a woman bound by chains. Fate had offered him another chance, though it came dressed in danger. At dawn, he set to work. The axe bit into logs with the fury of a man shaping more than firewood. He sharpened its blade until it gleamed cold in the light. He mended the door, patched the shutters, checked every nail and beam. His hands trembled at times, but he worked through it. The cabin, once a place of refuge, had become a fortress. Clara watched him quietly. When he paused, she brought him water, the cup steady in her hand despite the fear still etched in her face. She stood near him as he worked, as if by her presence she, too, was building the walls higher, making the space theirs and not theirs alone. By nightfall, Elias stacked the last of the wood by the door. He wiped the sweat from his brow and stared into the fire where Clara sat, her shawl drawn tight around her. He knew what waited beyond the ridge. Men with cruelty sharpened like knives, men who had already stolen too much from both of them. But he also knew this. Redemption was not found in running, nor in silence. It was found in standing, in facing the storm with whatever strength remained. He looked at Clara, her gaze steady upon him, and felt the truth settle deep in his bones. This fight was not only hers, it was his. Winter came early to Ash Hollow. Snow descended from the mountains in a slow, relentless drift, covering the valley in silence. The world grew muffled, every sound swallowed by the heavy white shroud. Even the coyotes' cries seemed distant, ghost-like. Elias Boone chopped wood until his shoulders ached, until the cold numbed his fingers through the gloves. Breath steamed from his mouth, mingling with the smoke rising from the chimney. The cabin stood stark against the snow, its patched timbers braced against the season's weight. Inside, Clara tended the fire, her shawl drawn close, her storm-gray eyes fixed on the flames as though reading omens there. For a time, the storm outside matched only the storm within. Their lives narrowed to coffee at dawn, wood smoke at dusk, the steady rhythm of survival. Yet beneath it all lay the waiting. Elias felt it in the stillness between his heartbeats. Clara in the way her gaze darted to the ridge at every distant sound. The men would come. And so they did. It began with hoofbeats muffled by snow. Elias heard them first, the steady rhythm, cutting through the hush. Clara froze, her breath catching sharp in her throat. He took up the rifle and moved to the window. 3 figures emerged from the storm, shadows against the white, their outlines hard and unforgiving. The sky above bruised with stormlight, a strange purple-gray that promised both snow and death. They came without words. Rifles cracked, sharp, as thunderclaps. Bullets tore into the cabin's walls, splintering wood, scattering sparks from the hearth. Clara flinched but did not scream. Elias pulled her to the floor, shielding her with his body as glass shattered from the window pane. Firelight leapt across the room, sparks falling like stars onto the floorboards. Smoke curled through the rafters, mixing with the bitter scent of gunpowder. Elias's body moved with grim resolve, each motion steeped in the memory of battles long past. Old scars burned as if remembering the steel that had made them. He returned fire, the rifle's kick slamming into his shoulder. One rider fell, his cry lost in the snow. The others spread wide, their gunfire relentless. The cabin shuddered beneath the assault, its timbers groaning like a wounded beast. Clara pressed against the floor, her white dress torn, the hem muddied, from ash and snow that blew in through the broken door. The chains still at her wrists clinked faintly, a cruel reminder of what had been. But in that moment, she looked not at the iron, but at Elias. Something shifted in her eyes. She reached for the spare rifle propped by the hearth. Her fingers, though trembling, closed steady around the wood. She rose to her knees, her braid falling, loose across her shoulder, and sighted down the barrel with the poise of someone who had waited her whole life for this choice. Her shot rang true. One of the men staggered in the snow, fell, and did not rise. Elias glanced at her, firelight catching. Her face pale as bone, fierce as flame. She was no longer the woman in chains beneath the hay. She was something else now. Defiant, ghostly, alive. Together they fought, their gunfire echoing like thunder across the hollow. The snow churned crimson where bodies fell, blood steaming, in the frozen air. The last man, wounded, cursed them with a voice ragged with fury. His eyes met Clara's through the broken doorway, but what he saw there, unyielding, storm-gray, drove the courage from him. He turned his horse and fled into the storm, swallowed by white, his figure vanishing like a shadow at dawn. Silence returned, heavy as the snow. Smoke hung low in the cabin, mingled with the scent of gunpowder and blood. Elias lowered his rifle, his chest heaving, his breath fogging the cold air. Clara still held her weapon, steady though her hands shook with the aftermath of defiance. Slowly, she let it fall. The chain at her wrist clinked one last time as it struck the floor, but the sound no longer carried weight. She stood, her torn wedding dress fluttering against the snow-drifted threshold, and for the first time she looked free. Elias stared at her, struck by the sight, the shawl slipping from her shoulders, her braid wild, her face lit by both firelight and snowfall. She seemed both a spirit of the valley and the woman fate had delivered to him in chains. They did not speak. Words would have broken the spell. Instead, they stood together in the doorway, the storm raging around them, the dead lying silent in the snow. Blood and snow mixed at their feet, death and rebirth woven into one. And in that terrible, beautiful silence, Elias Boone felt the burden of his years shift. The cabin, once bought for $50, had become a crucible. He had not sought battle nor redemption, yet both had come. And Clara, no longer a captive, had claimed her voice not with speech, but with fire. They were no longer drifter and prisoner, no longer silence and chains. They were survivors bound by will, standing side by side beneath a sky bruised with stormlight. The cabin bore the scars of battle. Bullet holes marked its timbers like dark eyes, silent witnesses to violence endured. The door sagged on one hinge, patched with hurried nails. Ashes smoldered in the hearth where sparks had once leapt like wild stars. Blood, scrubbed from the floorboards, left faint stains in the grain of the wood. Yet for all its wounds, the place felt alive. Winter deepened over Ash Hollow, snow gathering in drifts against the walls. But inside the cabin, warmth pulsed steady, defiant. Elias Boone moved through the rooms with measured purpose, repairing what could be mended, discarding what could not. His hands, scarred and calloused, found new steadiness in the labor. Each nail driven into timber seemed to bind not only wood, but also the fragments of himself, long scattered by years of wandering. Clara kept the fire burning. She wore her shawl close, though the warmth grew strong, and her storm-gray eyes softened in the glow. Her braids, once undone and dirt-streaked, she wove again with slow care, fingers deliberate, as if each twist reclaimed a piece of her spirit stolen in captivity. At times she sat in the rocking chair by the hearth, its creak no longer a sound of loneliness but of rhythm, of steadiness, of home. There she hummed softly, broken fragments of melody, not quite song, not yet whole, but enough to fill the cabin, with something that sounded like healing. Elias would pause in his work to listen. He would not speak, would not intrude. Instead, he brewed coffee in the dented pot, the rich, bitter steam rising into the rafters like prayer smoke. He brought her a cup, the metal warm against her fingers, the gesture simple, yet solemn. She accepted without words, sipping, her gaze steady on the fire, as though both flame and man before her offered something she thought long lost. Outside, the snow muffled the world. Moonlight lay across the valley in silver sheets, turning the drifts into ghostly fields. The rifles, once snarling guardians of survival, now hung quiet on the wall, their barrels catching the pale gleam. The chains that had bound Clara lay, discarded in a corner, rust already setting into their links. No one touched them. No one would again. Evenings passed in silence, but it was no longer the silence of strangers or fear. It was a silence thick with presence, with something unspoken lingering between them. Hope, fragile as spring grass daring to pierce the frost. One night, the wind rose fierce outside, howling through the chimney like some ancient beast. The fire snapped and spat in the hearth. Elias sat at the table, whittling a piece of wood into shape, though he did not know what form he sought. Clara rocked in her chair, her shawl drawn close, her braid resting over her shoulder. She watched him for a long while before speaking, her voice low, rough from disuse but steady. "You did not leave me there," she said. Elias set down the knife. His eyes lifted, shadowed by the firelight. For a moment he could not answer. The truth lodged in his throat like stone. He thought of the life he had led, the faces he had failed, the promises broken. He thought of the day he bought the cabin, for $50, seeking only silence, and found instead a soul in chains. "I could not," he said at last. She looked into the fire again, her profile etched in gold and shadow. Many would have. He had no answer to that. The wind moaned, the rafters creaked, but the silence that fell was gentle, not heavy. It lingered like a blanket drawn over both of them. In the days that followed, Clara began to step outside. At first, only to stand in the doorway, shawl wrapped tight, snow catching in her hair. Then she ventured further, her boots crunching across the frost-hardened yard. She touched the woodpile, the axe buried in the stump, the rails of the corral, half buried in snow. Each gesture was small, but Elias understood it for what it was. The slow reclaiming of the world, one step at a time. He watched from a distance, never pressing, never asking. The valley was wide, the mountains high, but he knew the true distance she crossed was within herself. One morning he found her standing by the fence, her gaze turned toward the horizon where the sky burned pale with dawn. Snow glittered in her braid, her breath plumed in the air. When she turned to him, her storm-gray eyes no longer held only fear. "There will be spring," she said simply. He nodded. The days stretched on, the cabin filled with rhythm, the creak of the rocking chair, the hiss of the kettle, the ring of axe against wood. It was no longer a place of hiding, nor merely survival. It had become something else. Fragile, perhaps, yet undeniable. One evening, as the fire burned low and the storm outside softened to quiet flurries, Clara rose from the rocking chair. She walked to the corner where the chains lay, rusted and brittle. For a long while she looked at them. Then without ceremony she lifted them and carried them outside. Elias followed, saying nothing. At the edge of the snowdrift she dropped the iron into the whiteness. The links sank, half buried, their dark weight swallowed by the pale expanse. She did not look back. When she returned inside, the firelight caught her face, and Elias saw not the captive beneath the hay, but the woman she had chosen to be. Scarred, defiant, alive. He poured coffee, set a cup before her. She sat again in the rocking chair, shawl around her shoulders, braid neat and deliberate. She sipped, humming faintly, the sound threading through the cabin like a lullaby. Elias leaned back, his body heavy with years, yet his chest lighter than it had been in decades. He did not think of redemption in words. He felt it instead, in the warmth of the fire, in the presence of the woman before him, in the quiet that was no longer empty, but full. The cabin, once bought for 50 cents, now held something beyond measure, and though neither spoke of the future, hope flickered between them like firelight. Fragile as spring grass, stubborn as mountain stone. Outside, the snow drifted soft in the moonlight. Inside, the fire burned, steady, and two souls, once broken, once lost, sat together in silence, their lives no longer bound by iron, but by the possibility of what might yet come.